You hear that phrase, Carver dogs, in certain circles, right?
Wow.
And it just feels, oh, it feels loaded, almost legendary.
hmm It paints this picture of these, truly top-tier animals.
Exactly. But what's the real story there? Behind the name, I mean, and the man himself, Maurice Carver.
Well, that's pretty much what we're diving into today.
Mm.
We're digging into an article by Richard F. Stratton, The Truth About Carver Dogs. It's from Stratton Pit Bull.
Okay.
And think of this as, like, your quick guide to understanding a really key figure. We're going beyond just the surface legend here.
Right. So for you, the learner, maybe you know this history well, or maybe you're just really curious. Our aim is pretty clear.
Yeah.
We want to get to the heart of Carver's story, but sticking just to what Stratton saw and observed firsthand.
We're kind of on a mission, you could say,
Yeah.
to figure out the truth behind that Carver dog's mystique. Looking at his methods and, well, the legacy he ended up creating, maybe sometimes without even planning to.
Okay, let's get into it then. Stratton kicks off with his first meeting with Carver. What were those first impressions like?
Well, it's interesting, the setting. It was a J.T. Collier convention back during the Korean War in Tennessee.
Yeah.
Stratton was a young sergeant then, hadn't met Carver before. But even then, Carver was sort of the center of attention.
Yeah.
A newer face, relatively speaking, but people were noticing him.
And he had dogs competing.
He did. 3 dogs matched at that convention.
Yeah.
And 2 of them, wow, they were apparently outstanding. Really caught the eye.
Stratton talks about one, a memorable bobtailed dog, even though Bob Hemphill apparently wasn't crazy about its fighting style.
That's right. And then there was this other one, this incredible red-nosed dog they called a leg breaker. Turned out it was Kern's Red.
A leg breaker. That sounds intense. Quite the introduction.
It really was. Stratton tells the story where Carver actually said something to Hemphill referencing Armitage's book.
Right.
Armitage had apparently written he'd never seen a dog break a leg in a match. And Carver jumps in saying something like, well, this dog of mine has broken 6 legs.
Wow. And did it?
Yeah, unbelievably. Right there at that convention, the dog did break its opponent's leg. Stratton says everyone just stood up to watch. It was quite a moment.
And the other dog, even with the broken leg, it still tried to scratch. That says a lot about its gameness.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned Bob Hemphill. He was really passionate about the old family red-nosed dogs.
Right. So he must have been interested in where these red-nosed dogs came from.
Exactly. Back then, just having a red nose didn't automatically mean it was true OFRN lineage.
Okay.
Hemphill really emphasized tracing them back. You had to go back to dogs like Centipede or Cyclone who came down from Lighthouse Vic. That was the real deal for OFRN.
So the main point here is that Carver, even though he wasn't famous yet.
Right. He had these 2 exceptionally good dogs.
Yeah.
Which really, it shows his eye for quality, even that early on.
And what about Carver himself, his personality? Did he make an impression beyond just the dogs?
Oh, yeah. Stratton noticed that. Even though he wasn't a big name, Carver had this charisma. People listened to him. They paid attention.
Mm-hmm.
Hemphill actually asked him, why don't you breed your own dogs? And Carver apparently said, kind of jokingly, that he just didn't have the patience to wait for them to grow up.
Huh. Okay.
And Stratton, being young himself then, he actually sort of got that. He compared it to other really respected dogmen, like Klaus and Greenwood.
Right.
They weren't known primarily as breeders either, but
Yeah.
they always seemed to have top-notch dogs on hand.
Okay, so let's fast forward. Decades go by. Carver does become this major figure. Stratton calls him a foremost producer of good dogs. But you said there's a hint of something unexpected.
Yeah, there's a bit of foreshadowing. Later on, Carver actually asked Stratton for one of his books.
Oh, interesting.
And Stratton put a little note in it, kind of reminding him about that old comment about patience and breeding.
Mm-hmm.
Given how famous Carver had become as a breeder by then.
Right.
And Stratton is very clear. He states point blank that some of the absolute greatest dogs ever came from Carver's kennels. But, yeah, he definitely sets up the surprise about it all.
So Stratton never actually met Carver again after that first convention?
Nope, never again. But he obviously heard things, through the grapevine.
Yeah.
And it sounds like Carver was, well, quite the character.
How so?
Well, Stratton mentions the southern way of saying his name, Morris. And that Carver was always sharply dressed, had a nice car, seemed like he had money, even early on.
Okay.
And then there were rumors. Stratton is careful to say he never confirmed them, but there was talk about various businesses. Things like houses of prostitution, even drug trafficking.
Important to stress, though, that Stratton himself says these were just rumors he heard.
Absolutely. He makes that very clear. But regardless of any of that other stuff, what was undeniable was Carver's knowledge of dogs.
He had that natural eye for the good ones, as Stratton put it.
Exactly. And he shares stories from friends who knew Carver later, like in the 70s.
Right.
They're always impressed by his charm, his deep understanding, his stories.
Right.
There's one anecdote about Bill Stewart being really blown away by Carver's black dog.
Helmer.
Yeah, because Elmer beat a son of this really famous dog called Alvin the dog, also known as Weasel.
Alvin the dog. Sounds like he deserves his own deep dive.
He probably does. Stratton mentions his incredible record, won 2 matches in one day, beat Danny Burton. Earl Tudor apparently thought Alvin was the greatest dog he had ever seen, hugely influential on pedigrees.
Wow.
So for Elmer, a Carver-associated dog, to beat a son of Alvin, that was a big deal. It really boosted Carver's reputation.
Makes sense.
And Stratton says lots of people would kind of brag about knowing Carver. He was held in really high regard.
Did Carver have dogs he considered his own best?
Apparently, he thought Ironhead was one of his greatest. And he was good friends with Floyd Boudreau, another major name.
Right, Boudreau. And that connection was important for Carver's dogs, wasn't it?
Very important. Stratton says point blank that Carver got some of his absolute best dogs from Boudreau's breeding.
Okay.
He touches briefly on Boudreau's own history and how Debo influenced his later breeding, including that amazing story about Blind Billy.
Blind Billy.
Yeah, Debo's son, who was blind, apparently only lost 1 match his whole career, and that was because he literally couldn't find his opponent.
That's incredible. Just incredible. Okay, so Carver had his own breeding, and he was also getting top dogs from people like Boudreau. But this leads us back to that surprise Stratton hinted at. What was it?
The big reveal, the surprise, is that Maurice Carver wasn't just a breeder. He was also a very savvy dog broker.
A broker. Okay, explain that.
He just knew the dog world inside out. He had this huge network, knew where the good dogs were everywhere.
Right.
So if he found a really good dog somewhere, maybe available cheaply, he'd buy it, and then he'd resell it.
Wow. Okay, so that's a bit of a twist, isn't it? Those ads he ran constantly in the game dog magazines offering dogs for sale.
They weren't necessarily all dogs he bred.
Exactly.
He had this constant stream of dogs moving through because the demand for anything associated with the Carver name was so high.
But people trusted him.
Yeah, and that's key. He built this reputation for being honest and for guaranteeing a good dog.
And why could he guarantee that?
Well, Stratton gives 2 main reasons. One, Carver just had this uncanny eye for spotting a good dog, assessing its potential, its gameness, its build, all that. And 2, some of the dogs were from his own breeding program.
Mm-hmm.
So either way, the buyer felt like they were getting something solid, a capable animal.
So for the buyer, maybe the exact origin wasn't the main thing. If Carver sold it, it was a Carver dog. And that name meant quality.
That's precisely it. That's how the whole Carver Dogs legend really got built. People kept getting good dogs from him, so they started, swearing by Carver Dogs. Many still think it's the best bloodline ever.
Because he consistently sent out quality.
Right. But the underlying truth, the surprise, is that not all of them, maybe not even most of them, were actually bred by him.
That definitely changes the perspective. It shifts it from purely breeding skill to also being about, incredible talent scouting and distribution.
Yeah. Stratton even talks a bit about the sort of romance people have with bloodlines.
How so?
He mentions being amused hearing dogmen talk about their secret formulas, you know, and how often it involved mixing in a little Carver blood.
Right.
He says people tend to romanticize lineage, kind of like being fiercely loyal to a sports team.
Yeah, I can see that.
And he draws a parallel to the Leitner bloodline. Apparently, even Mr. Leitner himself wasn't as obsessed with pure Leitner breeding as his followers were. He was open to bringing in outstanding dogs from elsewhere if they were good enough.
So this wasn't unique to Carver, then?
No, not at all. Many of the great old-time breeders were pragmatic like that. Quality often trumped strict pedigree purity for them.
So where does this leave Carver's legacy, then? Is he still seen as one of the greats, even with this broker aspect?
Oh, absolutely. Stratton argues he might be one of the best of that whole era, precisely because of his sharp judgment and how widely his dogs, the dogs that passed through his hands, were distributed and approved of. Even early on, remember, people listened to him. He learned fast. And he just had this knack for getting his hands on great dogs.
And he kept the really exceptional ones.
That's what Stratton implies. He rarely let the truly, truly top-tier ones go. But many of the ones he did sell, wherever they originally came from, they became foundation dogs for whole new lines.
It's different from someone like, say, John P. Colby, right? Where you knew you were getting a Colby dog bred by Colby.
Exactly. With Colby, the source was clear. With Carver, it was often fuzzier, but the result for the buyer was consistent.
They got a good dog.
They got a very good dog, usually. Often, as Stratton says, worthy of building a line on. And that really is the fuller picture behind the Carver Dogs legend.
Okay, so for you, the learner listening in, the big takeaway here is that this famous Carver dog's reputation, it's not just about his own breeding.
Right. It's just as much, maybe even more so, about Maurice Carver's incredible talent for spotting and distributing quality dogs, no matter who the original breeder was.
So now you've got a much deeper, kind of more nuanced view of a really significant name in this world.
Yeah. And it leaves you with something to think about, doesn't it? How often are reputations, brands, built not just on making something yourself, but on being really good at curating, at recognizing and guaranteeing quality, even if the origins are more complicated than the legend suggests.
Makes you wonder what other straightforward legacies might have some surprising stories hidden underneath.